Deputy Mark Hudson pulled up to the scene, his truck's tires crunching on the gravel as he parked under the flickering streetlight. It was late, and the neighborhood was unusually quiet. There had been whispers about trouble in the area lately, but nothing like this. As he stepped out of his vehicle, the smell of something terrible hit him, and his instincts told him it wasn't going to be a normal night. The crime scene was only a few steps away. The victim lay motionless on the ground, blood spreading out in dark red pools, staining the pavement. A man in his late 30s, someone Mark didn't recognize but figured was probably local, judging by the weathered clothes and the expensive watch on his wrist. The victim's body looked unnaturally still. The silence of the night seemed to heighten the tension. As Deputy Hudson walked closer, a chill ran down his spine. The scene looked brutal, like a fight had happened, but there were no signs of a struggle, no blood leading up to or away from the body. Something was off. But then, something even stranger caught his attention. Standing just a few feet from the body was a boy, no older than 10, staring at the victim with wide, fearful eyes. Mark's hand instinctively went to his radio, but he hesitated. The boy wasn't moving. His clothes were torn and smeared with blood, but it was hard to tell if it was his own. There was no sign of trauma to the child. He didn't appear to be hurt. His expression was one of shock, frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly approached, trying not to alarm the boy. "Hey there," Mark called gently, his voice calm, trying to sound reassuring. "It's okay. Are you all right?" The boy didn't respond. His eyes never left the body, as though he couldn't look away. Mark crouched down to the child's level, trying to get a better look. He was afraid to touch him, unsure if the boy would panic. The silence between them felt unbearable, stretching on far too long. Finally, the boy blinked and looked at Mark, his face pale, his lips trembling. But still, he said nothing. Mark stood up slowly, his mind racing. He didn't know if the boy had witnessed the crime, or if he had been involved. But either way, something was terribly wrong. The boy had to know something. There was no way he could have appeared out of nowhere. Mark glanced at the body again, his gut telling him that this was no ordinary murder. He had seen violent crime before, but there was something eerie about the way the child was just standing there, unmoving and silent. The fact that no one had heard anything, not a scream, not a shout, added to the confusion. There had been no 911 calls, no alarms raised by neighbors. It was as if the whole event had taken place in complete isolation. Mark's mind turned over possibilities. Maybe the boy had run here for safety, or maybe he had just stumbled onto the crime scene by accident. But why was he covered in blood? And why was he so quiet, not even reacting to the deputy's presence? With a deep breath, Mark called for backup, his voice steady but filled with concern. He needed more eyes on this, more experienced officers who could help make sense of what was happening. The boy was too young to be left alone like this, and something told Mark that the mystery was far from over. Deputy Mark Hudson paced slowly in the small interrogation room, his mind still racing from the scene. The boy had been taken to the station, and now he was alone, waiting for someone to speak to the child. But all Mark could do was think about this strange situation. Why was the boy there? Was he just a witness, or was there more to the story than he could see? The boy had been placed in a holding room, his tiny frame sitting stiffly in a metal chair. His eyes were wide, constantly scanning the room as though he expected someone to appear out of nowhere. Despite the officer's gentle attempts to comfort him, the child remained completely silent. The room had a stillness to it that seemed almost unnatural, as if the boy was trapped in his own world, not willing or able to communicate. Mark leaned against the doorframe, watching the boy through the glass. He felt a mixture of frustration and concern. The child's silence was unnerving, making everything more complicated. Had the boy seen something traumatic, something that left him unable to speak? Or was he too afraid to talk? Mark couldn't decide which one felt worse. Either way, the child needed help, and Mark was determined to get through to him. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him, and a local psychologist, Dr. Amy Hayes, entered the room. She had been called in to help the child, and Mark hoped she might be able to get through to him. Dr. Hayes was calm and patient, someone who had worked with children in distress for years. Mark briefed her on the situation, telling her about the boy's eerie silence and the blood on his clothes. As she listened, Dr. Hayes nodded, her face thoughtful. "I'll try my best," she said quietly, before entering the room with the boy. Mark stood just outside the door, waiting anxiously. He had a lot of questions that needed answers, but right now, the child was the key. If he could only speak, maybe they could figure out what happened. After a few moments, Mark saw Dr. Hayes step back out, a look of concern on her face. "Well?" Mark asked, his voice edged with anticipation. "He's not talking," she replied softly, "but he's not uncooperative. He's just scared. He keeps staring at his hands as though he's seeing something there. I think he's still processing what happened." Mark nodded slowly, understanding that the boy's silence was probably a result of shock. He had seen it before, the way people froze up in the aftermath of something terrible. But what really troubled him was the fact that the boy had been found at the crime scene, surrounded by blood but not a single mark on him. If he wasn't the one who caused it, what was his connection to the murder? "Can I try talking to him?" Mark asked. Dr. Hayes hesitated for a moment, but then gave a small nod. "Just be careful. It's easy to unintentionally pressure a child. We need to make him feel safe, not more afraid." With that, Mark stepped into the room, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of what was about to unfold. The boy looked up at him briefly, but then his eyes dropped back to his hands. Mark sat down across from him, trying to remain calm and non-threatening. "Hey there," Mark said softly. "I know you're scared, but we just want to help. Can you tell me your name?" The boy's gaze shifted briefly to Mark's face, but then, almost as if it took all his energy to do so, he slowly shook his head. Mark's mind raced. This was going to be harder than he thought. He was hoping for some kind of breakthrough, some small sign that the boy would speak, but all he got was silence. "What happened here?" Mark asked gently, not expecting an immediate answer but trying to show the boy that he could be trusted. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he blinked a few times and wiped his eyes, as though trying to force away the tears. Mark felt a pang of sympathy for him. This child was in pain, but the weight of that pain was invisible, locked somewhere inside him. After a long pause, Mark spoke again, more softly now. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but we'll be here when you're ready." The room fell silent again, but Mark stayed seated, patiently waiting. He knew it could take time for a child to speak about something so difficult, but deep down, he feared they were running out of time. The hours stretched on, and the quiet tension in the small room seemed unbearable. Deputy Mark Hudson sat at his desk, his eyes occasionally darting to the clock on the wall. It had been several hours since Dr. Hayes had left the interrogation room, and there had been no progress with the boy. He couldn't stop thinking about the scene, about the silent child covered in blood, standing alone by the body, and the eerie stillness that had followed him back to the station. Mark's mind raced, running through the details over and over again. Why had the boy been at the murder scene? Was he just a witness, or was there something deeper, something that connected him to the victim? The silence in the room was maddening, and the longer it stretched on, the more unsettling it became. He stood up, walking over to the window to get some fresh air. His thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was certain. There was more to this story than met the eye. The boy's appearance at the scene was no accident. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the child knew something important. But no matter how many times he tried to approach the boy, no words had come. The silence was suffocating. After a few minutes of pacing, Mark finally decided to return to the interrogation room. He couldn't let the boy's silence remain a mystery. As he approached the door, he took a deep breath, preparing himself for another attempt. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen, but he knew he had to try. Inside, the boy was still seated in the same position, staring down at his hands. His body language screamed fear and uncertainty. Mark hesitated for a moment, watching the boy carefully. He felt a deep pang of sympathy, but knew that he had to press on. He had to break through this silence if they were ever going to get to the truth. "Hey," Mark said softly, pulling up a chair and sitting across from the boy. "I know this is hard. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but I'm here to listen when you're ready. We just want to help you." The boy's eyes flickered up for a brief second, and for a moment Mark thought he might speak. But instead, the boy just looked away again, his hands clenched in his lap. Mark's heart sank. He had to be patient, but it was hard to keep that in mind when every second felt like an eternity. He leaned forward slightly, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "You're safe here," he continued in a gentle voice. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to know what happened. Can you tell me what you saw?" The room remained silent, save for the occasional sound of the boy's shallow breaths. Mark's instincts told him the child had witnessed something horrible, something that had shaken him to his core. But what was it? What had he seen at the crime scene that left him so traumatized? The boy's eyes finally moved again, not to Mark, but to the door. His gaze lingered there for a moment before he lowered his eyes once more. Mark followed the boy's gaze, realizing that the child was waiting for something. Maybe someone. Mark wasn't sure who the boy was looking for, but the fact that the child had been staring at the door in such a focused way made him wonder. It was as if the boy was expecting someone to come in and take him away from all this, someone he trusted. Mark sat back in his chair, considering his options. He couldn't force the boy to talk, and clearly the silence was a defense mechanism. But there had to be something, some way to get through. The deputy took a deep breath and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of paper. He laid it on the table between them and pushed it gently toward the boy. "This is a drawing," Mark explained. "Sometimes it helps people talk, just drawing something that's on their mind. You don't have to do it, but if you want, you can use it to show me something, whatever's bothering you." The boy stared at the paper for a long time, and Mark's heart skipped a beat when he saw the boy's hand tremble as he reached out to touch the edge of the paper. For a moment, Mark thought he might actually see the boy pick up a pencil. But then, as quickly as it had started, the boy's hand withdrew, and he returned to his quiet, withdrawn state. Mark stayed silent too, knowing that sometimes silence was the only way forward. It was clear that the boy wasn't ready to speak yet, but Mark was more determined than ever to help him. This wasn't going to be easy, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. The truth was out there, and somehow, they were going to find it. Deputy Mark Hudson leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window at the fading light of the day. The boy had been in the station for hours, and yet there had been no breakthrough. His silence remained unbroken, and Mark found himself growing frustrated. What was going on in that child's mind? Why wouldn't he talk? As the deputy waited, he kept replaying the events in his head. The boy, covered in blood, standing so still by the victim's body. It was unsettling, to say the least. Mark had seen many crime scenes in his years on the force, but this one was different. It felt like there was something hidden beneath the surface, something more than just a random crime. And the boy, he was the key. Just then, the door to the office opened, and a uniformed officer entered with some new information. "Deputy Hudson, we got a lead," the officer said, holding a folder in his hand. "We've been talking to the neighbors, and it turns out the victim had some connections with the boy's family." Mark's heart skipped a beat. This was the first real lead they had, something that might connect the dots. He stood up quickly, his mind racing. "Tell me more," he said, his voice tight with anticipation. The officer went on. "The victim, a man named Greg Turner, had a history in the area. He wasn't exactly a model citizen, had some criminal dealings in the past. But here's the twist. The boy's father, Malcolm Brooks, was involved with him. We didn't have anything concrete before, but it looks like they were in some kind of dispute. Mark felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. The pieces were starting to come together, but they were far from making any conclusions. "What kind of dispute are we talking about?" Mark asked, hoping for more details. "Well, we don't know much yet," the officer replied, "but we've heard rumors that Malcolm and Greg were involved in a business deal gone wrong. Something about money. But what's strange is that no one's heard from Malcolm in a few days. He's disappeared. People are worried, and we're trying to track him down." Mark's mind whirred with the possibilities. Could the boy have witnessed something he wasn't supposed to? Could he have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in something dangerous? It was starting to seem more and more likely. "I need to talk to the boy's aunt," Mark said suddenly, thinking out loud. If she knows about this connection, maybe she can shed some light on what the boy's father was involved in. The officer nodded and left the room to make the arrangements. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This had something to do with the boy's family, and Mark needed to figure out what that connection was before it was too late. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and the boy's aunt, a woman named Patricia, walked into the room. She looked worried, her eyes darting nervously around the station. Mark could tell she was just as shaken by the events as he was, but there was something else in her eyes too, something Mark couldn't quite place. She was hiding something, and he had to know what it was. "Deputy Hudson," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "I want to help you find out what happened to my nephew. I don't know where to start." Mark studied her carefully, his mind still racing. "We've been told your nephew's father, Malcolm, was connected to the victim," he began. "Do you know anything about that? About their relationship?" Patricia seemed taken aback for a moment, her face faltering. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "I don't know much. I mean, Malcolm and Gray had problems, sure, but I never thought it would end like this. But I do know one thing. Malcolm didn't want my nephew anywhere near Greg. He told me to keep him away from him, but I didn't really understand why." Mark's heart pounded as he heard this. The boy's father had clearly been protective of him, perhaps because of the danger that surrounded his dealings. But why had the boy been there, at the scene of the murder, if his father had warned him away? Was the boy involved, or was he just an innocent bystander? "I think your nephew knows something, Mrs. Brooks," Mark said gently. "He was there when it happened, and I believe he saw more than we realize. Can you help him talk? I need to know what he saw." Patricia looked uncertain, but nodded. "I'll try. I just don't know what he's been through. He's been through so much already." Mark watched her closely, sensing that there was more to this story than anyone had told him. It was becoming clear that the boy's silence was not just fear. It was something deeper, something that tied him to the victim and his family in ways they hadn't yet uncovered. As Patricia left, Mark sat back in his chair, the puzzle pieces coming together in his mind. But something was still missing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of discovering something huge. The boy's silence, the strange behavior of his family, and the shadow of the victim's past. They were all connected somehow. Mark just had to keep digging. Deputy Mark Hudson sat at his desk, his thoughts swirling as he stared at the files spread out in front of him. The more he uncovered, the more the case seemed to grow in complexity. He had been on plenty of investigations before, but this one was different. The boy, still silent and withdrawn, seemed to be at the center of it all, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay somewhere in the child's past. The boy's father, Malcolm Brooks, had now become the key figure. Mark's mind kept circling back to the connection between Malcolm and the victim, Greg Turner. According to the information Mark had gathered, Greg wasn't just some random person from the neighborhood. He had been involved in shady deals, with rumors suggesting ties to the underground world. Malcolm, the boy's father, had some dealings with him too, though the details were still unclear. But it was the disappearance of Malcolm that had Mark's attention. Was he hiding from something, or had he simply vanished after being involved in something dangerous? Mark was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of the door opening. Patricia, the boy's aunt, entered the room, looking even more anxious than before. She held a file in her hands, and Mark's heart raced as she walked over to him, her face tight with worry. "I've got something that might help," Patricia said quietly, placing the file on the desk. "It's not much, but it might give you some insight into what's been going on with Malcolm and Greg." Mark quickly opened the file, scanning through the papers inside. There were a few photographs of Malcolm with Greg at various points in the past. The pictures showed the two of them together in what seemed like casual settings, but the tension between them was evident. There was no clear indication of any criminal activity, but it was clear that their relationship had been strained. The photos didn't tell the full story, but they added a piece to the puzzle. Patricia, sensing Mark's confusion, spoke again. "Malcolm and Greg had been friends at one point, or at least that's what I thought. But there was always something off about their relationship. I didn't know the details, but I knew enough to keep my nephew away from Greg. He didn't want him around, and I never asked why." Mark looked up at Patricia, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the new information. So, Malcolm didn't want his son near Greg at all. Was that because of something Greg had done? Or was it something Malcolm feared? Patricia shook her head, looking uncertain. "I can't say for sure, but I always thought Greg had some kind of power over people, you know. He wasn't afraid to intimidate others to get what he wanted. And Malcolm, well, he was always more protective of my nephew than anyone else. He kept to himself a lot after he and Greg had a falling out." Mark's mind began to connect the dots. If Greg had that kind of influence over people, it made sense that Malcolm would want to shield his son from him. But why would the boy end up at the crime scene? Why was he covered in blood if he hadn't been directly involved? It wasn't adding up, but Mark knew that this was just another piece of the larger picture. "Did your nephew ever mention anything about Greg, or anything that could explain why he was there?" Mark asked, hoping for any clue that might lead him closer to the truth. Patricia hesitated, her eyes looking distant. "He never talked about Greg. But there's one thing I do remember. A few days before the murder, Malcolm was acting strange. He was on edge, and he kept talking about getting out of town, about leaving for a while. I thought it was just stress from his work, but now, I wonder if he was trying to escape something bigger." Mark leaned back in his chair, digesting this new information. Malcolm's sudden urge to leave made sense now. He must have known something, or at least suspected that something was going to happen. But why hadn't he taken the boy with him? Why was the child left behind? As Mark pondered these questions, he was interrupted by a call from one of the officers in charge of searching for Malcolm. "Deputy Hudson," the officer said, "we found something you need to see. We just located one of Greg Turner's associates. He's not talking yet, but we might have something that could lead us to Malcolm." Mark's heart raced. Finally, a lead that could point them in the right direction. He quickly grabbed his jacket, ready to head out. "Keep me updated," he said, his voice steady, but his pulse quickening with the promise of new information. As Mark left the office and made his way to the scene, he felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. If he could just figure out what had truly happened, maybe he could help the boy start to heal from whatever trauma he had witnessed. Deputy Mark Hudson pulled up to a small rundown house on the edge of town, the engine of his truck sputtering as it came to a stop. His thoughts were heavy as he got out, knowing that this house might hold the answers he had been searching for. It was the latest lead in the search for Malcolm Brooks, the boy's father, who had disappeared shortly after the murder. This was the address of one of Greg Turner's associates, a man who had supposedly been involved in the shady dealings between Greg and Malcolm. Mark had a gut feeling that this house could reveal more than just a connection to the past. It could explain everything. He knocked firmly on the door, his mind racing with possibilities. The officer who had made the call earlier was standing behind him, ready to assist. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 40s, grizzled and unshaven. His eyes narrowed when he saw the deputy. "What do you want?" the man asked gruffly, his voice rough from years of disuse. "I'm Deputy Hudson," Mark said, flashing his badge. "I'm here to ask you a few questions about Greg Turner and Malcolm Brooks. We know you were associated with them." The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, he stepped aside and motioned for Mark to come in. Inside, the house was dimly lit, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. The smell of stale food and cigarette smoke hung in the air. Mark immediately felt a sense of unease as he stepped further inside. This wasn't just the home of someone who had fallen on hard times. It felt like the home of someone with a secret, someone who knew too much but was hiding it. The man waved Mark to a chair, then sat down across from him. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice still cautious. Mark sat down, trying to be as direct as possible. "I need to know about Greg Turner and Malcolm Brooks. You worked with them, right? What were they involved in? Was there a deal gone wrong?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding Mark's gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but his tone was less convincing than his words. Mark could tell he was holding something back. "We know about the relationship between Greg and Malcolm," Mark said, pressing on. "There's something more here, and I think you know what it is." For a moment, the man sat in silence, looking out the window as if contemplating how much to reveal. Then, with a sigh, he finally spoke. "Malcolm and Greg, they got into some bad business. Not the kind of stuff people want to talk about, you know. I don't know the full story, but I know it had to do with money. Big money. Greg was always getting involved in things he shouldn't have. And Malcolm, he got dragged into it, whether he liked it or not." Mark leaned forward, his heart rate quickening. This was what he had been waiting for. "What kind of business?" he asked. "What exactly were they doing?" The man rubbed his hands together nervously. "I'm not a part of it, not really. But I've seen the meetings. Greg was dealing in stolen goods, weapons, things like that. He'd sell to the highest bidder, no questions asked. And Malcolm was getting desperate. He had debts to pay. And Greg was the kind of guy who could make them disappear. But it came at a cost." "A cost?" Mark asked, his voice steady. "What kind of cost?" The man shifted again, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know everything, but I know Greg had something on Malcolm. He used that to keep him in line. And when things went bad, when the money stopped flowing the way it was supposed to, that's when the trouble started." Mark absorbed the information, his mind racing. This was starting to paint a clearer picture. Greg had been in the middle of something dangerous, something that involved stolen goods and other illicit activities. And Malcolm had been involved too, trying to get out from under Greg's thumb. "What happened after that?" Mark asked. "Where did Malcolm go?" The man hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Malcolm didn't show up one day. He left, without a word. And after that, Greg started getting more aggressive. He wanted to get his money back, and he wasn't gonna let anyone stand in his way. But I haven't seen him since, either. I think he's hiding out somewhere, maybe trying to lay low." Mark's mind was spinning. If Malcolm had disappeared after the fallout with Greg, it made sense that the boy had been left behind. But why had the child been at the crime scene? Why was he the one found covered in blood? And what did he know about what happened to Greg? "One more thing," Mark said, standing up. "Do you have any idea where I can find Malcolm? Or anyone who might know more about him?" The man shook his head, his face pale. "I wish I could help you, Deputy, but I don't know where he is. If I did, I tell you." Deputy Mark Hudson stood in the quiet hallway of the station, feeling the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He had just left the rundown house, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there was still so much left unanswered. The boy, his father Malcolm, and the mysterious connections to Greg Turner. Everything seemed to be pointing in the same direction, but Mark still couldn't see the full picture. He walked back to his office, his mind swirling with thoughts. The information from Greg Turner's associate had been helpful, but it only raised more questions. The relationship between Greg and Malcolm was complicated, filled with debts and shady business, but it still didn't explain why the boy was found at the scene of the crime. The boy's silence was more than just fear. It was as if he was holding back something important. Mark sat down at his desk, his eyes falling on the photograph of the boy, still in the file from the first day of the investigation. The boy's face was a blank slate, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the child was hiding the truth, but he didn't know how to break through. As he sat there thinking, the door to his office opened, and Officer Parker stepped in. "Deputy, we've got an update," she said, holding a piece of paper in her hand. Mark looked up, his attention immediately piqued. "What's the news?" "The search team just found something. It's not much, but we found a receipt at Greg Turner's house," Parker explained. She handed him the paper. Mark took it and glanced at the details. It was a receipt from a storage unit rental, dated just 2 days before the murder. "This could be it," Mark murmured, his voice low. "If there's something in that unit, it might explain everything." "We think it's worth checking out," Parker replied. "We've already got a team on the way to the location. We'll keep you posted." Without wasting any more time, Mark stood up. "Let's go. This might be the break we need." The two of them hurried to the squad car, the urgency of the situation quickening their pace. Mark's heart raced as they drove through the quiet streets, heading toward the storage facility. The idea of finding something that could finally explain the connection between the boy and the crime was both exciting and daunting. The closer they got, the more his mind raced with possibilities. When they arrived at the facility, the search team was already on site, waiting for instructions. Mark quickly approached one of the officers in charge. "Any word on what we found?" Mark asked, his voice eager. The officer nodded. "We've got the key to the storage unit. It's number 15. We haven't opened it yet, but we're ready when you are." Mark nodded in acknowledgement and turned to Parker. "Let's see what's inside." Together, they walked toward the storage unit. As Mark unlocked the door, he felt a surge of anticipation. He had no idea what they were going to find, but he hoped that whatever it was, it would be enough to solve the case. The door creaked open, revealing the dim interior. Inside, stacked high on wooden shelves, were boxes, old furniture, and a few scattered items that seemed to have little value. But as Mark scanned the room, his eyes landed on a large cardboard box tucked away in the corner. He approached it cautiously, feeling the tension rise in his chest. When he lifted the lid, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a stack of papers and a few other objects, including a small worn notebook. Mark's hands shook slightly as he reached for the notebook. He flipped it open, scanning the pages. His eyes widened as he saw the names written inside, names that connected Greg Turner, Malcolm Brooks, and the boy in ways he hadn't expected. The notebook wasn't just a record of transactions or business dealings. It was a ledger of debts, some of which were terrifyingly large. There were references to people Mark didn't recognize, but there were also names that he did: lawyers, business owners, even other criminals who had worked with Greg. And there, at the bottom of one page, was a note that caught his attention. "I'm sorry, it's too late. He's coming for us. We're out of time." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. This was it. This notebook was the key to understanding the entire mess. But there was still one thing that didn't make sense. What role did the boy play in all of this? "Deputy," Parker's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "You need to see this." Mark turned to see her holding another object, a small plastic bag containing the torn-up letter. The handwriting on the pieces was unmistakable. It matched the note in the notebook. As she pieced it together, Mark's stomach sank further. It was a letter from Malcolm to Greg, written just days before the murder. The letter contained an apology. Malcolm stared at him for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, with a sigh, he opened the door wider, stepping aside to let Mark and Parker in. "I didn't want any of this," Malcolm said as he gestured for them to sit. His hands were shaking slightly, but there was no anger in his eyes, only exhaustion. "I didn't want my son involved in any of this, but it was too late once Greg got involved. I made mistakes, big ones." Mark sat down, his eyes focused on the man in front of him. "Tell me everything," he said. "I need to know how your son got caught up in this." Malcolm looked down at the floor for a moment, then met Mark's gaze. "It all started when Greg offered me a way out. He said he could help with my debts, but he wanted something in return, information. And when I couldn't pay him back, he started using my son as leverage. That's why I tried to keep him away from Greg. I knew it would only get worse." Mark's heart ached as Malcolm spoke. He could see the guilt and fear in the man's eyes. "So what happened that night? Why was your son there?" "I didn't want him anywhere near Greg, but Greg kept pushing. I tried to get out, tried to protect him, but it wasn't enough. That night, I got into a fight with Greg. He was threatening to hurt my son if I didn't deliver what he wanted. I don't know what happened after that. I just wanted to keep him safe. I ran, but I left my son behind, and I never should have." Mark let the silence hang between them. The truth was now out in the open, and though it was painful, it made everything clearer. Greg Turner had used the boy's father as a pawn in a game of criminal deals, and when things had gone wrong, Malcolm had done everything he could to protect his son, even if it meant running away. "We need to get your son back to safety," Mark said softly, standing up. "And you need to answer for what happened. But for now, let's make sure he's not caught in the crossfire anymore." As Mark walked out of the cabin, the weight of the case seemed to lift ever so slightly. There was still work to do, but the boy would be safe, and that was the most important thing. As the car doors slammed shut, Mark's thoughts went to the child at the station, wondering how long it would take for him to heal from everything he had witnessed. But for now, they had done their part. The truth was finally out, and the boy could begin to rebuild his life, free from the shadows of the past.